What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show here. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out every single week. Good show in store today. Going to start with some of the biggest developments in Europe heading into this international break, and then jump into what I'm going to call kind of the beginning of my MLS playoff preview, do a check-in on MLS and break all 29 teams down into tiers and kind of set the stage for this final push for the playoffs as the regular season starts winding down. Before I get to that, though, two big stories to address in the past few days. The first one, of course, Jorge Vilda no longer the manager of the Spanish women's national team. No surprise, this was coming after all of the events that have occurred following their World Cup triumph. He was very much attached, whether he wanted to be or not, to Luis Rubiales. Once Luis Rubiales lost any of his power and was thrown out to the extent that they can throw him out at this point. Obviously, suspended, not fired yet, but we all know where that is going. Vilda just didn't have the support he needed. This was the way this was going to go, but it is now official. This series of events is what happens when you choose not to listen to your players. Because now it's a really awkward situation where Vilda feels hard done because he won a World Cup and then got fired in large part because of somebody else's behavior. Because that was the only way this was ever going to move forward, is to get rid of both of them because he had no staff, no support. Which was basically the same story when those letters were sent and that group of players decided they weren't going to play for him anymore. That's when the decision should have been made, before you got to a World Cup. But now you have different people in power, and so they're not going to move forward with him. And we're never going to move forward with him. He had to go in order for Spain to rectify some of the things that are happening here, and to try and not get in this situation or something similar again. But most of this could have been avoided if they had simply listened to the players and said, these players are really good. Whether we agree with them or not, it's in our best interest as a federation to do what they ask when they are that strong in their opinion. Because the players are much more important than the coach. And I know they won the World Cup without most of those players, and they won it with Vilda as manager. I get all that. But that still is not a team that liked or maybe even respected its manager. That was clear from the celebrations and the way everything played out. You got to be something awfully special to be so valuable to an organization that they're willing to disregard all of that. Luis Rubiales was. And so Vilda kept his job. And again, you can have a conversation about whether he should have been fired, how valid the players' complaints were. That's neither here nor there at this point. Because the players now have the power. And I made this point once Rubiales decided he wasn't going to resign, and then FIFA eventually stepped in to suspend him. That's the only way you can go at this point. The players are in control when everybody, we're pushing 100, I believe, from the initial boycotters to all the people who signed the petition saying they're not going to play with Rubiales in charge. It's basically your entire national team setup saying they're not going to play. Everybody's on the same page. There's no turmoil between players at different clubs and all that kind of stuff. The players are in complete control. And so Vilda was not going to last. But this all could have been avoided by simply doing the smart thing, whether you thought it was the right thing or not. The smart thing was to say, our players don't believe in our manager. He hasn't done anything to suggest that he is irreplaceable. Our players are pretty darn good. Let's side with the players. It was in your, just not from a moral, even from a moral or ethical standpoint, just from a practical standpoint, that makes more sense. The Federation refused to do that. Rubiales refused to do that. And so now you had this really awkward situation where these players delivered that outstanding performance in the final, and nobody's wanting to give Vilda any credit for it. And then all the other stuff happens with Rubiales, and so here we are. And part of this is that he did get put in a tough spot by Rubiales at the meeting where it looked like Rubiales was going to resign, and then he emphatically said, I'm not resigning. I do feel bad for Vilda in that sense because he couldn't have known what he was walking into. I'm pretty confident he thought he was walking to Rubiales' resignation announcement. And then Rubiales gets up there and he starts basically just publicly declaring Vilda got a pay raise and a new contract. How much you want to buy the explanation that that's what Vilda was clapping for, to each their own on that. But at least it's logical. That was probably the final straw. But I do think it was headed this way anyway. Because you just can't, this is not a sustainable way to run an organization, to have this much tension between the player and the coaches. And in sports generally, the players are going to win. Especially against a coach who doesn't have an awful lot on his resume in terms of, right, this is not Pep Guardiola, this is not Bill Belichick, this is not Serena Wiegman. If you want to keep it more specific to women's soccer, Emma Hayes. This isn't somebody who's won a World Cup, won a European Championship. That's really just where I come down on this is it would have made life a lot easier for everybody if this would have happened when it should have. The minute those players said, we're not doing this anymore. But now with everything that's happened, it's not surprising that Rubiales said, I don't care. Because he clearly doesn't care about any kind of public perception or public relations, considering where we're at now. And the entire, you've got different organizations within and outside of soccer going after him, and he still hasn't resigned. So it's a very strange legacy for Vilda. To me, there are some things you have to applaud at the World Cup. Some of that is how much was he actually involved and how much did the players just take it upon themselves to do what they wanted? There are only a handful of people that know the answer to that question. Those players and the coaching staff. But from the beginning, I just didn't see it being worth it to keep him. And ultimately, even though Rubiales was somewhat proven right by the fact that they won this World Cup without those players and with Vilda as the coach, I said, excuse me, I said immediately after that final, you can flip that too and say, if they had actually gotten a coach that they wanted, respected, enjoyed playing for, and the support of the Federation, we might be talking about something way more than one World Cup, considering how much talent is on this team. We'll never know. It is what it is. Very bizarre, complicated legacy, but Jorge Vilda is out. There was one way this is going to end, and now it is official. I also want to spend some time talking about general developments at Manchester United, both on the Antony front and the Jadon Sancho front. on top of everything else United have been dealing with from a PR standpoint, you now have these two situations going on. Obviously very different, so I'm going to split them up, but I did want to talk about both of them. Antony, obviously this is incredibly serious, especially coming off of the back of Mason Greenwood, to have another player accused of domestic violence. And United puts out this statement saying we're taking this seriously and basically nothing else. They're aware of what's going on. Don't do anything to change Antony's status, to give an update on his status. It was the most basic, non-informative statement you could have. And so to me right now, there is one answer to this and one way to handle it. He doesn't play. And I say that for a multitude of reasons. One, to me, that is just the right thing to do in any situation like this. That way you don't jump to conclusions on either way. You don't immediately rip up his contract or whoever's being accused contract. You give them the opportunity to prove their innocence and to go through an investigation and to go through the legal process. And you also don't just continue allowing them to play like nothing is happening, because that's not all right either. So do the same thing you did with Mason Greenwood. Just get him away from the team. So there's that part of it that, to me, morally and ethically, that's just the smartest, most sensible, fairest thing to do. There's the other parts of this too, though. I don't know what would change United's mind or help them make a decision in the near future on this. What kind of information are you getting in the next couple weeks that's going to just provide this clarity about what you're supposed to do? These legal processes take an incredible amount of time. You didn't hear anything about Mason Greenwood for months, and then something would happen, and then he would just go right back under the radar, and then another step in the legal process or something, until eventually the legal process was done and they had to make a decision. I don't know what information is coming 3 weeks from now that's going to change United's mind on how they want to approach this. So make the decision now. And the second part is the public relations part of this, which is, after very much appearing to do a U-turn on Mason Greenwood and to try and convince people, not very well in my opinion, that you had never really truly intended to bring him back, that you were just preparing for all the possibilities, when all the reporting says otherwise. And that it sure seems like United just caved to public pressure to then not take a strong stance by simply saying these allegations are serious, they need to be investigated. While that is happening, Antony is not playing. To have those two things happen on right after one another is a very concerning commentary on where United are in these situations and how they're handling them. Because to me, it says there wasn't a lesson really taken away from the Mason Greenwood situation. And again, they're not the same. There's a lot of things involved in both of them. I'm not trying to lump them together. But I would just think that the inclination would be to get out ahead of it and to take a strong stance and say, we need more information until we figure out exactly what's going on and learn what we can about the situation, hear from Anthony, hear from the victim, hear from the police. We're not putting him on the field. Maybe that's what ends up happening, but to me, it's just not a hard decision to make. Because the longer you take with these kind of things, and the more unsure you are about them, the more you lose the benefit of the doubt, if it's even there still, about you actually caring about this kind of stuff and prioritizing it over the results on the field and over getting talented players to perform for your club. So we're going to have to see where this goes. It is kind of... These are never easy. They're never black and white. It's very gray. And I really do try to stay in the middle and not go too far on the he can't ever play for them again, because you just don't know. And everybody deserves their opportunity to tell their side of the story. And from what I've seen, Anthony is maintaining his innocence. He has every right to do that. So you don't want to get into a legal situation where you're unfairly terminating people's contracts either. But nothing says you have to play him. And if you're serious about trying to hold people accountable for these kind of things and to actually get to the bottom of it, and to use a moral compass rather than a monetary one, there is one answer and one way to approach this to me, and that is you immediately make it clear he is not playing until more information is available and you see how the legal process played out. That is the part of it I thought that Manchester United handled well with the Mason Greenwood stuff. Is that there was support and care for the player without disregarding the severity of what he was being accused of. Because those two things can go together. The question is whether United can actually find a way to do that in this Anthony situation and whether they ultimately choose to do so. The second part of this is Jadon Sancho. And I want to touch on this a little bit as well. Obviously, completely separate situations. But of the things going on at United, not in the squad over the weekend, Erik ten Hag says it's because he didn't perform well enough in training. Jadon Sancho says that's nonsense. There are other reasons. Basically just accuses Ten Hag of lying. And so here we are. This situation, to me, comes down to two things: knowing your personnel and communication. And here's why I say that. I was reading an ESPN report saying that sources are telling them Erik ten Hag is not backing down from his stance that this was related to Sancho not meeting the standards he wanted in training. If that's the case, why doesn't Jadon Sancho believe that? And why is he willing to go public saying he doesn't believe that? This is not Jadon Sancho complaining about a lack of playing time. That is something different. This is Jadon Sancho upset with his manager for feeling like the truth is being distorted or withheld, whatever word you want to use, and he is being presented in an unfair light. The mental health part of this is real. And the relational part of this is real. because everybody's going to handle a situation like that differently. And Jadon Sancho has not had it easy since getting to United, obviously. He's gone through some things. And that's why I said this is about knowing your personnel. Because if Ten Hag is trying to get some message across, I'm not sure this is the way to do it to Jadon Sancho. Some other players, maybe that is the way that they respond and just how they're wired. It makes a lot more sense. But you cannot treat everybody the same, because you are not treating everybody equally is not treating everybody the same. That's what I wanted to say. Because people receive things differently. Showing respect to Jadon Sancho and showing you care to Jadon Sancho may look different than showing respect and showing you care to Roy Keane. They just see the world differently. And I picked Roy Keane as an extreme example. And so if this was born out of not feeling like Jadon Sancho is living up to what you expect of him, going public with that is probably not the way to do it if you're trying to actually get to a resolution everybody can get back on the same page. So to me, it's kind of one of those two things. Either Ten Hag just didn't communicate clearly to Sancho in a way he could process what was happening and why he made the decision he did, or Erik Ten Hag didn't understand the person he was working with, or didn't think about it that way in terms of how what he said was going to be received, because there's clearly some kind of fundamental disagreement here. And I think it has to come down to one of those two things. And it's hard to know, exactly what Ten Hag said, exactly what Ten Hag's reasons were, what had gone on before, anything else that might factor into Sancho's thought process and the way he interprets this. But I refuse to just pile on Jadon Sancho here. Because like I said, this is not simply just somebody upset that they're not getting playing time. This is somebody who feels like they're not being respected as a person. And I'm not going to sit here, generally speaking, and maybe ever, but at least as a general rule, I'm not going to sit here and criticize anybody for that. Because everybody is wired differently. As a leader, that's on you to know how your players are wired and how they're going to respond to things. So looking at it from the 1,000-foot view without the details, that's really what I kind of boiled this down to. And the other thing I'll throw out there, keep in mind the optics of this kind of stuff too, considering everything else that's happened at United. If this continues and Sancho is just left out in the cold, well, for example, Antony has continued to play with these domestic violence allegations. There is that part of it too. That United has had to make some choices on things that are a much bigger deal than Sancho not training well. And I have really respected the way Ten Hag has set a culture and expectations about the way this club operates. The way he handled Ronaldo, in general, the fact that he sat Marcus Rashford on the bench for accidentally sleeping in and missing a meeting. Because if Marcus Rashford can get away with it, why shouldn't everybody else be able to? And he owned it. It was just an honest mistake. It's not a big deal. He came on, did his job. No issue. Mistakes happen. But there is that danger of getting too far onto the other side of this. where you're so focused on the soccer specific stuff that you can lose sight of the people behind it. You can lose sight of the bigger picture and the more life aspect and treating people well. And I'm not saying that's what happened here, but it's just a thought that crossed my mind considering how things have played out at United and the decisions United seem to have made about how to handle all of these different situations that have presented themselves from Ronaldo to everything happening now to Mason Greenwood during Ten Hag's tenure. So we'll have to see where this all goes, both with Antony and Jadon Sancho. But that is my quick thoughts on what has occurred so far. Going to take my first break. When I come back, MLS tiers. I love breaking things down into tiers. I do it for most tournament previews. I'm going to do it for MLS right now, looking ahead to the playoffs. Who are your underdogs? Who are your dark horses? Who are your contenders? And who are your favorites? You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out every single week. It is MLS tier time. With the international break, not as many games and major developments happening, I thought this would be a great time to kind of jump back into MLS and set the stage for the end of the regular season as we get closer and closer to the playoffs. So as always, when I do tiers, I've got 4 of them: underdogs, dark horses, contenders, favorites. A couple things I want to say right at the beginning here. One, this is based on MLS Cup aspirations. So it's not necessarily power rankings. And it is based in part on the playoffs and what the standings look like. If you have to play a bunch of road games, that factors into the conversation as opposed to you being a team that it looks like is going to get to play at home a lot in the playoffs. The other side of that is this is how I think the teams stack up in terms of their chances of winning MLS Cup. So just because you're third in the East right now or third in the West, and you'll see this with some of the way I've divided this, does not mean you're automatically one of the favorites. Because there are still teams that are not in the top 3 of either conference that I believe in. I'm going to sort of lay out why as we go through here. So starting with our underdogs. These are the teams technically maybe still hanging in there, but don't expect to be a factor in the conversation. And most of these teams are more or less just out of the playoff conversation at this point. Of course, it's MLS. Wild things can happen, but I have 6 underdogs: Chicago, Colorado, NYCFC, New York Red Bulls, Portland Timbers, Toronto FC. Going kind of in backwards order: Toronto, Red Bulls, NYCFC, Colorado. I just don't see them getting into the playoffs. And if you don't get into the playoffs, obviously, you can't win MLS Cup. Portland, it's going to be difficult. Just made a coaching change. But they are still in the mix in the West. Found a way to get a point against Seattle after being down 2-0. There is some positivity there to build on. I wouldn't be stunned if they made the playoffs. I don't see them doing anything if they get in. There's nothing about that team that terrifies me or makes me look at them and go, that's the team that's going on a run. And I know that's part of Portland's MO, is they're not typically a great Western Conference regular season team. and they show up, and somehow, whenever the Sounders don't make MLS Cup, the Timbers have over that 5 or so year period before LAFC last season. But this is not that Timbers team. Defensively, it's been bad most of the season. You don't feel like their attack is all that dynamic. You don't have a Diego Valeri there to have that game where he's the best player on the field in the semifinals or something, Western Conference final or something. I just don't see a path to a deep playoff run for Portland. And the other team is the Chicago Fire. The Fire have this tendency to kind of tease you and think maybe they can make the playoffs, and then it kind of falls apart at the end. So I'm not holding my breath they're actually going to get in. But even if they do, I just, especially in the East, I just don't see a path forward for them. So those are my 6 underdogs, teams that wouldn't be shocked if 1 or 2 of them make the playoffs, but I'm not really even considering the possibility that any of them win MLS Cup. Next, we have the dark horses. So these are the teams that not going to pick them, but would not be absolutely floored if they find a way to make a deep run to get to MLS Cup, maybe even win it. I've got 10 of these. Atlanta, Austin, Charlotte, DC, Dallas, LA Galaxy, Minnesota United, Montreal, San Jose, Sporting Kansas City. And this is where I start talking about why I wanted to clarify things at the beginning, that this is my views on teams that can win MLS Cup. Because if you look at the table, Kansas City probably doesn't deserve to be in the dark horse category. But they are surging when most of the other Western Conference teams in this section are struggling. And I have been consistent from the very beginning. I absolutely love this team. I think they are going, if you ask me, I'm giving them better than 50% chance of making the playoffs with what they're doing right now. And the fact that just you had to get all the pieces there, and you had to get them gelled and kind of comfortable, and that is exactly what's happening. Maybe they don't have quite enough, but I'm not betting against this team now that they're rolling. And you do have the LA Galaxy playing a little bit better, getting some big wins recently, still hanging around the playoffs as well. But the rest of those teams in the West, Austin, Dallas, Minnesota, San Jose, not inspiring a lot of confidence at the end of the season. So that's part of why they're in this category as well, is you're probably going to have to play a bunch of road games, and now could change it in the next month, but none of them are really on an upward trajectory right now. To me, the team that is dangerous that I could see making a run is Kansas City. And then in the East, you've got the collection of Charlotte, DC, Montreal, just trying to make the playoffs. I love what Wayne Rooney is doing in DC. There's just a ceiling there. Same thing with Montreal and Charlotte. I just don't see a deep run. But I will put their chances of making the playoffs better than Chicago's, which is why they're dark horses, not underdogs. Because if you give yourself an opportunity, maybe something happens. The reason Atlanta is here is that I just have a mental hurdle trusting this team to be consistent enough to get to the final rounds of the playoffs, to go make a deep run. Defensively, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's a train wreck. Sometimes they score boatloads of goals, sometimes not so much. They're just too up and down for me. Wouldn't be a fun place to play a playoff game. Wouldn't be shocked if they have a really good game and knock somebody off. But I don't see putting together 3, 4, 5, 6, the kind of run that you need to get to MLS Cup and ultimately win it. So that's why they are in the dark horse category as well. Number 2 is the contenders, or the third section, second from the top. I've got 8 contenders. Houston, Miami, Nashville, New England Revolution, Orlando City, Real Salt Lake, Seattle, Vancouver Whitecaps. I will start with Miami and get this out of the way first. You cannot be a favorite when there is no guarantee you make the playoffs, when you're losing Lionel Messi to international duty, and even if you make the playoffs, you're going to have to go through the entire thing basically on the road, barring a very bizarre series of events. I will continue to say this part of it as well. This Miami team, if you take their road performances across the board, Leagues Cup, MLS play, to me, that is not good enough to win MLS Cup. They had to go to a shootout with Dallas and kind of rescue that game late. They had to have a shootout with Nashville. Eventually, you're going to lose one of those shootouts. It's not like they just went on the road and dismantled every single team they played. Now, the part that makes this interesting is they did go to Philadelphia and win, and they did go to LAFC and win. They can go beat anybody in any venue at any time. So they have to at least be contenders. Anything less than that is incredibly disrespectful. But I can't make you a favorite if I don't even know that you're going to make the playoffs. If this was starting from scratch and you told me they were getting in, then absolutely they're a favorite. But their road is not going to be like everybody else's in that favorite category. And as good as they've been, I still have not seen enough to convince me that they can go win road game after road game after road game after road game, often against the best teams in this league who will now have seen them before. Houston, 5 consecutive clean sheets and 10 goals scored in those 5 games, 3 wins, 2 draws. Ben Olsen is doing a terrific job. That roster is sneaky good. In a West that's just kind of been blah, they're running right up the table. Again, I'm not making them a favorite, but they deserve at least contender status. They are better than most of the teams who are going to enter the playoffs in the West, especially if they keep this going and continue to play this well and are in such good form heading into the playoffs. I want to save Nashville for last. Revolution, Orlando, Salt Lake, Vancouver. Pretty much just the same story for all of them, which is if I am one of the other teams that's going to be competing with them for those top spots, going to have to face them hypothetically in the later rounds of the playoffs, I'm just not that scared. The ceiling is not there for me. Doesn't mean they can't win. And obviously, RSL have had some playoff success pulling upsets. It's a little different if you're more of a 4 or 5 seed rather than the final team getting in. Orlando have, just won a U.S. Open Cup. Just won in Cincinnati. Revs have been good this season. And the Whitecaps, I do think they get slept on a little bit. I do think they're actually going to do it this time and put together a really solid season, but not hold my breath about a playoff run. I just can't convince myself that they are true favorites to win. Difficult outs, yes. But if I am, for example, Cincinnati, and you're asking me who I want to play in the Eastern Conference Final, who I want to end up finishing second, those in the East, those kind of things, I'm picking Orlando and New England before I want Miami, before I want Philly, before I want Columbus, and before I even want Nashville. And then real quick on the Sounders before I get to Nashville. Sounders are just having a weird season. In a very different way than last season was weird, but they're going to be right up there, near the top of the West, and also there's just nothing particularly convincing about what they've done this season. To me, it's more of a story of the rest of the West struggling than it is the Sounders being that good. So yes, you've got to respect them. Obviously, they know how to do this. But this is not a Sounders team that woke up halfway through the year and then all of a sudden from August on looks like the best team in the league. Those teams typically make it to MLS Cup and they often win it. That's not the story here. It's a team that just blew a 2-0 lead to the Portland Timbers. And yes, the red card had something to do with that, but still. So that's why they are not in my favorites category either. Nashville. Nashville is the one team I feel like I bumped up significantly from where the standings suggest they should be. Oh, and outside Inter Miami, of course, which in Miami have their own rules at this point. So I will continue to say this and be consistent with it. I do not care how much they have been struggling. I don't care what seed they are. I want no part of that Nashville team in the playoffs, especially if Sam Sturridge really gets going. To me, he can be the most impactful summer signing in the playoffs. Now, if Miami make it, obviously it's Messi. But if you just kind of exclude Messi from the conversation because he's just on his own level, if they can just get one more productive striker and just turn things around here. They have played Miami really, really well twice. That is what they can do. They are built to play in knockout tournaments. You get one more difference maker in attack, get everybody healthy. I know Walker Zimmerman's missed some games here. I will forever believe in this team's ability. Am I going to pick them to go through a gauntlet that's probably going to involve 2 to 3 of the 5 favorites I have? No. But if you're telling me a team has to win 2 road games to get out of the East, and you make me pick somebody, if Miami don't make it, I'm picking Nashville. So I had to put them as a contender. To me, as long as they make it, they have a real chance to win this thing. Because of how balanced they are, how good they are defensively, and just the way they play. They are built to frustrate teams, to make games really difficult, to keep Lionel Messi in check, and to give themselves the kind of opportunities they gave themselves in those 2 games against Miami. And then, as I alluded to, 5 favorites, 3 from the East, 2 from the West. Obviously Cincinnati, Columbus Crew, LAFC, Philadelphia Union, St. Louis City. Cincinnati has to be here. Don't really need to explain that. And the Crew are finally looking the part. This is the team I thought they would be all along. These were my 2 teams heading into the season, Columbus and Kansas City. I'm a big Wilfred Nancy guy. It's all starting to come together. They just haven't been quite as good as I thought, but they're getting there. They are the kind of team that if you peak at the right, they could peak at the right time here. And if they just keep going, they were not the best team in the league from start to finish. But they might be the best team in the league by the time MLS Cup ends. And you just go, I mean, they were playing the best of anybody. Kind of like the NCAA tournament, right? It's not that the best team always wins, but you can also look back at a tournament where the best team didn't win and say, that's a deserving champion. UConn last season, perfect example. That is actually a really good analogy for how I feel about Columbus now that I'm thinking about it. There were times where you just went, that's the best team in the country. And then they fell apart and you kind of wondered what happened. And then they woke back up and figured it out and just demolished people in the NCAA tournament. And you go, I don't know if they were the best team in the country, but they were clearly the best team in the tournament. That's, to me, what Columbus can be. I am 100% on board with this. The other thing I will say, though, is... Actually, before I get to that part, just to address the other couple teams here. Any team with LAFC's roster and LAFC's pedigree automatically gets in this group. I don't care where they finish. I know they haven't been good this season. I'm the first person to harp on that. And how fortunate they have been and the missed opportunities they've had to really cement themselves here by picking up a bunch of trophies and barely getting the... I have been critical of LAFC. But they're absolutely a favorite. Because they can just turn it on at any time. And the thing Steve Cherundolo has done is turn this team into a multidimensional force that can win games multiple ways. That's what you have to be to succeed. That's why they won MLS Cup last season. So obviously they're in there. And then any team that has home field through MLS Cup, or through the conference final, sorry, is also here. So congratulations, St. Louis City. They're in great position to win the West. I think that's what's going to happen. And you look down at the rest of the teams, and none of them really scare you. Does it mean that they're going to make it to MLS Cup? Not necessarily. I'm not sure I'm going to pick them. I got to see how things go. But if you just have to win home games to get to MLS Cup, you're automatically a favorite. And then the Union are going to be there because they don't lose playoff games at home. They generally don't lose at home. They're battle tested. They found a way to get through last season, nearly beat LAFC in LA. I mean, you don't really need to explain why the Union are there. So those are my 5. The one thing I will throw out there that is, to me, going to be potentially the storyline of the playoffs, and one of the storylines for the end of the regular season in terms of how the playoffs set up. If Cincinnati and Philly finish 1-2 in the East with the 2 best records in MLS, which I would expect to happen, I do not like anybody's chances of having to get through one or both of them. To me, if they meet each other, that is the game. Now, of course, Miami could do this and make things real interesting if they have to go through both of them and then another team on the road to win MLS Cup. But specifically from the Western Conference standpoint, or if you are Miami, if you're Columbus, if Nashville puts to, or Orlando, whoever, the idea of having to play one of those teams on the road in the conference semis, play the other one in the conference final, or if you're St. Louis, hypothetically winning the West, to know that you have to go play one of those 2 teams probably on the road. And this is no guarantee because the Union are not in second right now. It's very close between them, Orlando, and the Revs. But I expect the Union to come out on top of that. And I wouldn't even be floored if the Union make the Supporters' Shield race interesting. It is closer than you think based on what the table says right now. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Cincinnati's coming to Philly when MLS play resumes. After the international break. Not this weekend, but the weekend after that. If the Union win that game, this might get interesting. But if those teams finish 1-2 and they finish with the best records in the league so that they're home field priority over all the Western Conference teams, you're going to have a hard time convincing me somebody pulls that off. Unless they somehow both lose. But if they're 1-2, which means that they don't meet until the conference final, and at that point, one of them is guaranteed to host MLS Cup, I just have a real hard time. I could see Miami doing it. I could see Columbus doing it. I could see LAFC doing it. I could see potentially Seattle and maybe Nashville. And that's about it. So that is the other storyline and main thing I'm watching with these favorites is how does this all shake out the rest of the regular season here? Do you get those Eastern Conference teams stacked, whether it's 2, whether it's 3, that finish with the best records in the league? Because the best teams in this league play in the East right now. LAFC have not been great. I mean, the expansion team is winning the Western Conference right now. With all due respect to St. Louis City. That just doesn't scare you the same way Cincinnati, who looked almost unbeatable at home and who have been so dangerous in the Union with everything they've accomplished the past few seasons. So that's one of the big storylines I'm looking at is, can those 2 teams in particular, who are so good at home, wrap up home field advantage to the extent that they can? Obviously, they can't both have it in the East. but can they go 1-2 and just make everybody else's life really, really difficult? That if you just win your home games, one of you is playing and hosting MLS Cup. So that is MLS tiers heading into the stretch run of the regular season here. I'm going to take my second break, and when I come back, a quick weekend look ahead, taking a look at the biggest games during this international break and in Major League Soccer this weekend. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back one final time to the Touchline Talk Show. It is time for the weekend look ahead. Pretty brief version here with so many leagues off during this international break. But a couple international games to highlight and then some Major League Soccer games to discuss. CONMEBOL qualifying starts this window. Messi is not just going on national team duty to go play some friendlies. Chile at Uruguay on Friday is the big CONMEBOL qualifier I am looking at this weekend. And then a couple other games I wanted to highlight that are not as high stakes. Of course, the U.S. men's national team playing Uzbekistan on Saturday. You've got a Germany-Japan game. This Germany team still trying to figure things out. Really good test against Japan. And then Mexico-Australia also on Saturday. Interesting game. Two organizations kind of headed in different directions. Lots of positivity with Australia. Mexico trying to find their footing again. So interested in that one. And then Major League Soccer. Not a full slate by any means, but some very, very interesting games this weekend. Starting with San Jose at DC United on Saturday. Two teams hovering right around the playoff line. Trying to build some momentum here. Make sure they're on the right side of that line come decision day. Your big one, Sporting Kansas City at Miami on Saturday. Every game so high stakes for Miami. How do they deal with Messi being gone? And Sporting Kansas City, I also need every point they can get to try and get themselves into the playoffs. And another really good test for Miami. Can only learn so much without Messi there, but that's a Kansas City team playing quite well. New England Revolution at Minnesota United on Saturday. Another one. So much at stake for both teams. Minnesota trying to continue to climb in the West. Revs trying to get as high as they can in the East. LAFC at Portland on Saturday. Timbers running out of time. Got to start racking up points. LAFC, how do you respond from what happened against Miami? And then St. Louis at the LA Galaxy on Sunday. Galaxy need to keep this thing going, keep racking up wins, can't drop points at home. And St. Louis City obviously trying to wrap up first place in the West. That is all for the weekend look ahead. And that is all for today's show. I did want to take a couple moments to talk about a programming announcement here. This will be the last edition of the Touchline Talk Show as you know it. I have accepted a job that will prevent me from being able to consistently do this on Wednesday nights, consistently be able to be locked in to Champions League games, which was kind of the whole idea behind this live show. Anyway, don't worry, Touchline Talk is not going anywhere. Videos are not going anywhere. YouTube channel is not going anywhere. I will still be producing content, and I still also want to do some lives, whether that's reactions to big games, MLS Cup, those kind of things, or big news stories. I'll have to figure out exactly what that's going to look like, but Touchline Talk is here to stay. There will be more videos coming your way. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in to the live show. I've really enjoyed doing this. There's something special about it being live that I really enjoyed the challenge of it and the preparation and all of that. So thank you so much for all the support. Continue to be on the lookout for more content. got some exciting stuff in the works that I'm hoping to be able to announce in the next couple days. That is all for tonight's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for all of your support for the Touchline Talk Show, and I will see you next time.